The Hope Scholarship, West Virginia's voucher program for private and homeschool students, is set to expand to all K-12 students in the 2026-2027 school year at a time when enrollment and funding for public schools are decreasing. Our Chase Campbell has the details.
West Virginia's Hope Scholarship is set to expand to all K-12 students next fall, a move supporters call a milestone for school choice, and one that's raising urgent questions about where public education fits into the state's future. The scholarship allows families to use state education dollars for private school tuition, homeschool expenses, and other qualifying costs. Since launching in 2022, it has doubled in size every year. Last year, more than 10,000 students received the scholarship at a cost of over $40 million. With universal eligibility opening in the fall, lawmakers are bracing for that number to grow dramatically. The budget currently awaiting the governor's signature sets aside over $170 million for the program. Meanwhile, in the same budget, state aid for public schools decreased by $8 million. For schools like Wood County Christian, the expansion is welcome news. Executive Director Shane Hostetler says 30 to 40% of his students already use the scholarship, and he expects that number to climb.
One, the students who have always attended here that are from West Virginia are going to be able to get that Hope Scholarship, which is about 60% of our student population. So I look for many of those to apply for the Hope Scholarship, but it's also going to open the door for a lot of families to choose Christian education.
Hostetler argues that the scholarship, the amount of which is based on how much the state school aid formula provides to public schools per pupil, is effectively returning tax dollars to taxpayers.
Federal tax dollars and things of those nature still go to the public school. It's the local private tax dollars that you're paying in that follow the student, and school choice is about those dollars going with the student. And so I wouldn't be in favor of a cap just because they're still paying into the system. They ought to have a say in where their money goes.
Hostetler acknowledges the scholarship, currently around $5,000 per student, doesn't fully cover tuition at most private schools. But he argues it makes private education accessible for families who couldn't otherwise afford it. Advocates for public schools suggest there's insufficient oversight over how Hope Scholarship dollars are spent. Dale Lee, co-president of Education West Virginia, cites numerous examples of Hope Scholarship funding going toward expenses distant from the classroom.
We spent a ton of money on dance studios, on jiu-jitsu lessons, on guitar lessons. We spent $58,000 at a cheerleading and gymnastics school in the Eastern Panhandle. You know, those are things that I don't believe the intent was to be used for. Now, they will argue that those are physical ed activities for the Hope Scholarship students. Our public school girls who are cheerleaders have to pay themselves for gymnastics. They don't have that opportunity.
Lee says these and other examples point to a program that lacks basic accountability.
If we gave $100,000, spend $100,000 to Steubenville, Ohio public schools that charge tuition, so we paid that out today. That's taxpayer dollars.
An independent report from the RAND Corporation, prepared at the request of the West Virginia House of Delegates, recommended against the universal expansion and called for income-based eligibility requirements, noting that most newly eligible students would be families already paying for private school or homeschooling, meaning the scholarship would largely subsidize spending they were going to make anyway. In this year's legislative session, bills that would have placed guardrails on the scholarship, including income caps, spending restrictions, and accreditation requirements, were introduced but never made it out of committee. The only change lawmakers have approved was shifting scholarship payments from twice a year to 4 times a year. The legislative session ends at midnight on March 14th. Chase Campbell, WTAP News.